Oh, it is very good to have you here, and we are very delighted to be able to welcome Carl Trueman here this afternoon. And since this wonderful conference is called the Bible and Reformation, I may begin differently from how we normally introduce academicians. This will be about books and where they taught and all that, by simply saying, welcome to the pastor. Carl Trueman is an ordained minister and a pastor, which means that he, week by week, gives or delivers, brings the Bible to the lives of ordinary people, which seems fitting for a Reformation scholar like that, does it not? I could say a lot about Carl Trueman, and I think he summarizes well on his website for the church, really, what it means to be a Reformation scholar and how that relates to what we do as ministers of the gospel, even in an academic setting. He says here, we seek to share with others the great news that in Christ, God has been gracious and merciful to us. In Him we find freedom and forgiveness, and that the path of life is clear with Jesus as our Lord and Savior. That summarizes pretty well, I think, what this is about. Carl Trueman holds the Paul Woolley Chair of Church History and is professor of church history at Westminster Theological Seminary. He received his MA from St. Catherine's College in Cambridge and his PhD from University of Aberdeen, where he also taught before he came to Westminster. Trueman's academic interest includes Reformation, church history, particularly the life and work of Martin Luther and John Owen. He's a member of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, the North American Patristic Society, and, wait for it, Kerkhistorische Gesellschaft. He's the author of over a dozen books, numerous articles, book chapters, and also writes regularly in firstthings.com on contemporary issues as religious freedom, identity politics, and the state of the church. Notably among his books are Reformation, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow from 2000, edited in 2011, Luther on the Christian Life, Cross and Freedom in 2015, and John Owen's Reformed Catholic, Renaissance Man in 2007. And he's currently co-editing with Bruce Gordon the Oxford Handbook of Calvin and Calvinism, forthcoming in 2007. And on my way over here, I just picked up a slip from Baker that you are co-writing also with Bob Cobb, whom I saw here, also a book that should be coming out as we speak, October 2017, if I remember right. It's just about now, is it not? We welcome you gladly, looking forward to your paper. The Great Undoing, Martin Luther, last of the medievals, the first of the moderns.
Thanks very much for the kind words of introduction. It's a great honor to be here. Delighted to be invited to speak at such an august institution. There are two spare chairs here if somebody wants to come and grab them. And if you don't find it too creepy, there is a place just to my right where you can sit and listen to me as well, rather. So if anybody wants to do that, please feel free. As is often the case when you're asked to give a title of a lecture sometime in advance, the paper I'm going to give is a slight tweaking of the one that I originally proposed. The title remains The Great Undoing, but the subtitle is Luther, the Reformation and Modernity. So I was working on the paper, I felt that this was a more constructive way of going about the topic. Amidst all the celebrations of the 500th anniversary of Luther's call for a debate on the matter of indulgences, a call, of course, traditionally seen as the public trigger for what became known as the Reformation, there is a spectre which haunts some of the more thoughtful discussions and reflections about the 16th century Protestant revolt. Has it proved ultimately to be less a glorious staging post in the history of humanity's ascent to freedom, and more the opening of a Pandora's box of evils, which has impoverished culture, undermined religious faith, and paved the way for the various malaises of modernity? The traditional Protestant understanding of our own history is, of course, one of liberation, a tale of progressive and positive developments, one that starts with the heroic tale of one monk against the world. By taking a courageous stand, Luther helped to shatter the religious monopoly of a corrupt and decadent church. And from this, various good things slowly but surely emerged. Notions of equality, political freedom, rising literacy, the intrinsic value of ordinary life, the birth and growth of modern science, etc. By contrast, in this narrative, the Church of Rome was seen to be reactionary and to have come to accept only very late freedoms which Protestantism took for granted. As British analytic philosopher Anthony Kenny recounts in his autobiography, as late as the 1950s, he, a priest, had to obtain special permission to read David Hume as part of his PhD research, and indeed was only allowed to read David Hume in a particular room where he could be observed doing so. Indeed, according to popular Protestant understanding, it was not until Elvis Presley had done his finest work that Rome finally embraced the social, cultural and political benefits that Protestantism made possible and the West took for granted. I appreciate that's a controversial statement. Some people privilege Elvis's later work, but I think the pre-national service is really where it's at. Yet that narrative is now under severe strain. A large part of this comes from the fact that Western culture, the Western culture which Protestantism helped to form, is now seen, at least by many traditionally religious people, as being itself under severe strain. The dissolution of traditional sexual mores, the banality of a daily life shaped by consumerism, the weakening of such basic principles as freedom of speech, the increasing problems besetting the idea of the nation-state, the loss of any sense of transcendence, a widespread moral relativism, and the general feeling of decadence, pointless busyness, and boredom, which marks contemporary life, are all signs of this. To these we might add the rising challenge posed by alternative, apparently more powerful modernities, as exemplified by China, India, Russia, and Islam. Given this, the question is, was Luther the man who intentionally or not unleashed the forces of a modernity which ultimately contained the seeds of its own destruction? To put it more simply, from the perspective of the 21st century West, were Luther and the Reformation a good thing or a bad thing? To assess this, I think it is worth looking at influential critics of the triumphalist narrative. Three influential critics of the traditional Reformation narrative are the philosopher Charles Taylor and the historians Brad Gregory and Carlos Ira. All of these are writers from the last decade, but elements of their basic critique are of much older vintage. All three, I think, to some extent echo sentiments found in Max Weber. Weber is arguably the most significant source for critiques of the Reformation, or modern critiques of the Reformation, which do not focus on theological and ecclesiastical results so much as sociological consequences. Weber's work is key to the now commonplace notion that the modern world is marked by disenchantment and that it is Protestantism, particularly in its reformed variant, which is central to this, and which was, as it happens, and I think not insignificantly so, the religion of Weber's own mother. It is to Weber that we therefore owe the basic idea that Protestantism disenchanted the world and paved the way for the prosaic existence which Weber observed in the industrialized Germany of his day. And to a large extent, Weber's thesis, basic thesis, continues to set the terms of debate down to the present. Charles Taylor. I should also add that the three men I'm going to critique are all individuals whose work I've benefited immensely from. My attitude to their work as a whole is not entirely negative by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just picking on those bits that I disagree with today. Charles Taylor's approach to the question of secularization connects to Weber in that disenchantment is a point he takes as absolutely basic for any understanding of the intellectual and cultural conditions of the modern Western world. To this, he also adds a number of other ingredients. Most important, I think, of these is the element of choice in religion, which he regards as an obvious legacy of the Protestant Reformation. The chaotic marketplace of religions which we have today is for Taylor a hallmark, perhaps the hallmark, of the secular age even though we might typically see the ideas of religion and the secular as antithetical. Each of these, according to Taylor, finds its origins in the religious world of the late Middle Ages and the Reformation. He sees the Protestantism of Luther and those who came after him as pressing religious renewal in three key areas. And I quote, "The turn to a more inward and intense personal devotion, a greater uneasiness at sacramental and church-controlled magic, and the new inspiring idea of salvation by faith, which erupted into a world riven with anxiety about judgment and a sense of unworthiness," end quote. The net result, expressed with greater nuance and inevitably, I think, when we're dealing with Taylor, greater prolixity than Weber, is disenchantment. While Taylor acknowledges that the initial impulse of Luther's thinking was to expand the sacred to cover all of life, and thus had a universal sacralizing tendency, this was precariously balanced over against an emphasis on personal sanctification. This personal inward direction ultimately carried the day and had the opposite effect. It stripped the sacred away from the public sphere. Religion's importance for Protestants lay in its inward significance, not in its outward impact on the ordering of society. Brad Gregory, and it is with Gregory that I'm going to be most occupied, I think, in this paper. Brad Gregory's contribution to plunging the narrative of Protestant triumph into crisis is his immensely detailed volume, The Unintended Reformation. Gregory's approach is far more polemical in style than the more descriptive Taylor. It is clear from the outset that he regards many of the products of modernity, above all its chaotic moral relativism, as deplorable, and there is little doubt whom he regards as being to blame. Two quotations from his introduction give the sense of his overall thesis. First, and I quote, "This book's principal argument is that the Western world today is an extraordinarily complex, tangled product of rejections, retentions, and transformations of medieval Western Christianity, in which the Reformation era constitutes the critical watershed." End quote. In other words, it's the reformers who did it. And second, and I quote, "My point of departure is therefore the banal observation that human life in the Western world today, and perhaps most obviously in the United States, is characterized by an enormously wide range of incompatible truth claims pertaining to human values, aspirations, norms, morality, and meaning." End quote. Hard to argue, I think, with his description. It's the origin, I think, that is the point of contention. For Gregory, the cacophony of modern life can be traced back to the watershed moment of Luther and the Reformers. The consequences might well be, as the subtitle of his book suggests, unintended, but they are nonetheless directly related to the intellectual and ecclesiastical moves made by the Reformers of the 16th century. Given the more narrow focus of his book, Gregory's analysis is considerably more detailed than that of Taylor. The primary culprits for him are to be found in the metaphysics, which he claims the Reformers made normative, and from which modernity sprang. Two aspects of this are particularly worthy of note. First, he sees nominalism as undermining the idea of the unity of knowledge, leading to the fragmentation and eventual functional autonomy of different areas of study. Second, and related to the first, an emphasis on the univocity of being, which emerges in Duns Scotus and is radicalized by William of Ockham, served to undermine any notion of God's transcendence. This provided a metaphysical grounding for the collapse of the distinction between the sacred and the secular, as well as leading to the anti-sacramentalism of the Reformers. Dr. Zachman, I can't have you on the floor. Please take the chair, as I'm absolutely certain.
There are many people who would like to see me there.
I was going to say you don't have to bow when you come into the room and I'm speaking, but to these two we might also add the role of voluntarism. Though Gregory does not highlight this in particular, it would seem that the emergence in the late medieval period of voluntaristic notions of God's absolute power would also serve to weaken sacramentalism by rendering sacramental efficacy a matter of divine whim. So much for Gregory. I'll come back and give my response in a few moments. Carlos Ira makes a powerful contribution to the crisis of the received Reformation narrative in a fascinating article in 2014, Incombustible Weber, How the Protestant Reformation Really Disenchanted the World. Here Ira defends Weber's basic thesis that Protestantism was instrumental in disenchanting the world, but defends it in a manner which rejects the simple dichotomy of magic versus religion, which Weber used and which informed earlier critiques of his theory, and I think would now be regarded as too simplistic to work today. Ira offers three avenues for seeing the world disenchanting impulses of Protestantism. First, he says, Protestantism drove a wedge between matter and spirit in a way that forced the supernatural out of the natural and denied access to the divine via the material. Second, and following from the first, Protestantism redrew the relationship between the supernatural and the natural. The two obvious consequences of this were the rejection of the continuation of miracles and the denial of mystical ecstasy as a means of union with God. Third, Protestantism severed the realms of the living and the dead. No longer could prayers be offered on behalf of the dead. No longer would the dead intercede for the living. The two realms were distinct and had no practical relevance for each other. Ira's defense of Weber's basic thesis is therefore nuanced and sophisticated. It avoids any discussion of the nebulous and contentious concept of magic, while making it clear that Reformation Protestantism involved fundamental changes in thought which had significant and obvious implications for the way the natural world was understood in relation to the supernatural. It would certainly seem that disenchanting would be a legitimate term for describing that which Ira articulates. These three figures, Taylor, Gregory, and Ira, make learned and compelling cases for the significance of Luther and Protestantism for modern secularization. Yet it would seem to me that the cases they make are not invulnerable to criticism. So first, I would like to offer some general comments by way of making the question they seek to answer more complicated than they have allowed. And second, I would want to look specifically at Martin Luther and ask if the very fountainhead of Reformation Protestantism is guilty of the crimes, intended or not, with which the movement he inspired is charged. So, some general reflections there. One of the striking things about the work of Taylor, Gregory, and Ira, particularly in the cases I pointed to, is the lack of reflection upon the role of technology in the transformation of the world. The historical narratives they espouse are fundamentally idealist ones. It is commendable, I think, that they take ideas seriously. But that to which they point, the disenchantment of modernity in the secular world, is defined not simply or even primarily by intellectual attitudes, as much as by patterns of behavior that are inextricably connected to certain material conditions. Gregory makes the case for the primacy of ideas most explicitly, and I quote, "Beliefs influence behavior, whether among the old order Amish or the new atheists. And beliefs differ radically. A hyper-pluralism of religious and secular commitments, not any shared or convergent view about what we think is true or right or good, marks the early 21st century," end quote. There is nothing in that statement with which I can disagree. But I would want to add that material conditions, especially technological potentialities, also shape behavior and shape how people think, often in very profound and important ways. Research on contemporary sexual mores, for example, and sexual mores, I think, are perhaps the textbook example of the transformation of the world which Gregory decries, has made this clear. The advent of cheap and effective contraception, and more recently vast amounts of privately accessible internet pornography, have transformed sexual practices and the understanding of what sex and even personhood means. I can imagine arguments being made that Luther, in denying that marriage was a sacrament, somehow helped to trigger the secularization and disenchantment of the institution. But I would argue that it made little or no practical difference until the advent of no-fault divorce and the pill in the 1960s. Thus, any account of the mindset of modernity has to take account of the material conditions of modernity. I'm going to be returning to that point a number of times. Second, Taylor, true to what I see as his fundamentally optimistic philosophy, does not evaluate modernity and find it wanting, but rather seeks merely to explain how our world has come to be. Ira and Gregory, however, are clear that the results of disenchantment are highly problematic. Particularly Gregory makes very explicit his dislike of the current state of American culture. Now, to hold the position of critic is, of course, legitimate and often makes for more interesting analysis than mere detached description can offer. And yet it does beg some significant questions. The most obvious is, how does one separate those things of which one approves in modernity? I'm likely to be slightly facetious at this point and say, analgesics, antibiotics, and flush toilets, for example, from those of which one disapproves. It's indisputable that Protestantism helped to shatter the political and social structures of authority in medieval Europe. But was this a good thing or a bad thing? The moral anarchy we see around us in the West today may well be the descendant of the Protestant revolt. But history has not thrown up many attractive alternative approaches to modernity. Nor do I think that 15th century Europe was necessarily a better place to live than 16th century Europe. Connected to this, we might also highlight other aspects of the modern world which provide the basic framework for the relativist anarchy, which Gregory and Ira, rightly in my opinion, decry. I find myself in broad sympathy, if you like, with what they dislike in our culture. I'm just not sure that they can have their cake and eat it. The social aspiration to universal education, an enlarged democratic franchise, and the notion of individual rights and freedoms, these too find their origins in the Reformation by, perhaps at times, a complicated genealogy. But are they necessarily bad things in and of themselves? And can one have them without at least running the risk of that which Gregory and Ira lament? Take the issue of literacy. And this, I think, is an area that is not talked about sufficiently in theological circles when we talk about the impact of Reformation on authority. The call to teach people to read was a basic element of the Reformers' program, and that for obviously Protestant reasons. Luther desired to promote literacy so that ordinary people might read Scripture. Tyndale's claim that he wanted even the ploughboy to know more of the Bible than the priests may well be apocryphal, but it reflects a basic Protestant aspiration, one we find codified in Knox's First Book of Discipline with its call for parish schools. All should be able to read so that all can read the Bible. That is because Protestantism is a religion of words, spoken words and written words. Clearly, this is what Luther is assuming when he encourages his hairdresser, Peter Beskendorf, the Wittenberg barber, on how to revive his prayer life. And I quote, "First, when I feel that I've become cool and joyless in prayer because of other tasks or thoughts, for the flesh and the devil always impede and obstruct prayer, I take my little psalter, hurry to my room, or if it be the day and hour for it, to the church where the congregation is assembled and as time permits. And I say quietly to myself, and word for word, the 10 Commandments, the Creed, and if I have time, some words of Christ or of Paul, or some Psalms, just as a child might do." End quote. While preaching and vernacular liturgy at the heart of the Protestant Reformation, reading is a priority too. Yet this, I think, is where the matter becomes complicated. It is hard to imagine that the critics of the standard Reformation narrative would lament the fact that we live in the West in a world where there is a much higher degree of literacy than the 16th century. Yet that is both the result of Protestantism and something which brings in its wake a host of the kind of problems highlighted by contemporary critics of Reformation Protestantism. Research indicates that there is a connection, albeit often a somewhat complicated one, between rising literacy rates and a rise in political self-consciousness. There were various research done in South America in the 1960s. There's a fairly recent UNESCO report available on the internet that makes that point. You teach people to read, they become more politically self-conscious. To put it bluntly, that means that rising literacy rates bring with them always a risk, and often pose a fundamental challenge to whatever happened to be the structures of authority at the time. we might say, if literacy increases, a crisis in authority is never far away. Attacks on Luther, therefore, for unleashing what has become a sort of popular mantra, for unleashing pervasive interpretive pluralism, and thus theological hermeneutical chaos on the world, can be, I think, critiqued from various angles. But one basic point of response might be this: pervasive interpretive pluralism is the risk one always runs, nay, perhaps the inevitable outcome of rising literacy rates. The more people that can read and have access to the Bible, the more likely it is that competing interpretations will be offered. There is thus an irony involved in academic professors who lament the chaos of modernity through the writings they can only produce on the grounds that they are themselves literate and can only sell on the grounds that their audience can read. Raises a question, I think. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? We might also remember here that the chaos of denominations which Protestantism has brought in its wake, and which is often blamed on its lack of a coherent authority, is something which cannot be studied in isolation from the wider context. I believe Charles Taylor is correct in seeing choice, specifically religious choice, as lying at the very heart of our present secular age. Yet choice in religion is something that, yes, may have existed conceptually in the 16th century, but was difficult to realize legally until the 19th, and practically until the 20th. For choice to be meaningful, people had to be able to reach a variety of places of worship on a Sunday. Thus it was really predicated, I think, on the development of cheap and easily accessible transport. The automobile caused a veritable explosion in choice, not simply, of course, on the religious front, and also shattered old-style notions of church discipline. I think the automobile is what really transforms church life in the West. No longer did the tight-knit, self-contained community hold the power it once did. Individuals and families could choose where to worship and could choose how much influence or control over their lives they were willing to cede to their pastors and their priests. University of Being. People always glaze over when you mention University of Being. I'll try to make it as interesting as I can. It's hard work, but I'll do my best. Central to Gregory's case is an alleged shift in metaphysics, which takes place at the Reformation. A shift from an analogous understanding of divine and created beings, such as that found in Thomas Aquinas, to a univocal understanding of the same. Of course, as Gregory points out, this shift actually occurs with Duns Scotus in the late 13th century, though he never then seems to ask the question, well, exactly who is responsible for this then? Gregory identifies univocity as part of the broad metaphysical framework that facilitated the rise of modern science and thereby excluded God from discussion of the world as science conceives it and simply made him one being, albeit superior, among many. Yet Gregory overreaches when he claims that this univocity can be traced through the theology of the Reformers, especially in their Eucharistic views. A specific example he cites is Huldrych Zwingli, and I quote, "Whether it was explicitly recognized by its protagonists or not, the denial that Jesus could be really present in the Eucharist, which is particularly clear, for example, in Zwingli's spatial dichotomizing of Jesus' divine and human natures, and the claim that he sits at the right hand of the Father, has left the world and is no longer among us, is a logical corollary of metaphysical univocity. A spiritual presence that is contrasted with a real presence presupposes an either-or dichotomy between a cryptospatial God and the natural world that precludes divine immanence in its desire to preserve divine transcendence." David Bebbington will get the allusion, maybe nobody else. I'm tempted to quote that great scholar Frankie Howard at this point and say, "Nay, nay, thrice nay," in response to that particular statement. The statement cries out for a response. First, Luther and his followers did believe in the real presence, objectively there in the elements to believer and unbeliever alike. This was the whole point of the Marburg debacle in 1529, the Wittenberg Concord of 1536, and the post-Luther controversies surrounding the Augsburg Confession Variata. So a significant part of the Protestant world rejected the position of Zwingli and maintained a clear understanding of the real presence. More to the point, to claim that Zwingli's view is a logical corollary of univocity is a logical step way too far. It may well be that the position of Zwingli is compatible with a univocal metaphysics, but whether they are necessarily connected as corollaries is too strong a claim. Zwingli's own position was articulated in terms of biblical exegesis and Chalcedonian Christology. And I'm not very sympathetic to Zwingli, I have to say. I just think that it is a travesty to nail him on this particular point. Indeed, at the great debate between the Lutherans and Zwinglians at Marburg, the testimony of the Church Fathers played an important role. Further, the absence of Christ's humanity from the elements of bread and wine was predicated in large part by Zwingli on his assumption that a physical body could only be in one place at one time. Such a view does not in and of itself seem to demand or even to imply a necessarily univocal metaphysics. One might go on and ask how deep Scotist and Occamist notions of univocity influenced Orthodox Reformation Protestantism in general. The answer would appear to be very little, if any at all. Occam was certainly a huge influence on Luther, but it was his nominalism and his voluntarism, not his metaphysics of being, which played the key roles in his formulation of justification. The impact of Scotus on Calvin, I think, is increasingly accepted, but again, it is the voluntarism, not univocity, which plays a key role. Then if we move into the 17th century, a figure like William Twiss, first prolocutor of the Westminster Assembly, rigorous Calvinist and scourge of contemporary Platonists, drew explicitly on Scotus for his understanding of God's will and discussions of necessity, but he repudiated Scotus's position on two metaphysical points which are typically regarded as Scotist hallmarks. He accepted the real distinction between existence and essence, which Scotus rejected, and he rejected the univocity of being, which Scotus affirmed. Beyond that, in the wider frame of Reformed theologians, it is now clear from the scholarship of the last 25 years that the dominant metaphysics of being was drawn from the medieval Thomist tradition. From this angle, Reformation Protestantism actually and ironically appears as a valiant attempt to retain the kind of metaphysics of which Brad Gregory approves, rather than a manifestation of univocity and a staging post of the disenchanted universe of modern science with its exclusion of the divine. We might describe the metaphysics of, say, the Westminster Confession as a form of scotistically modified Thomism. It is not an example of univocity. The living and the dead. The separation of the living and the dead by Luther and Protestants is one of the points made by Ira in his connection of Protestantism to the modern disenchanted world. Again, this is a very interesting question. On one level, of course, he is correct. Central to much Protestant polemic was the emphasis on physical death as the great watershed. Believers alive on earth were forbidden to pray to believers who had died and gone to heaven. The first part of the answer to question 94 of the Heidelberg Catechism, dealing with the teaching of the First Commandment, is representative of Reformation Protestantism as a whole. Question: what does the Lord require in the First Commandment? Answer: that for the sake of my very salvation, I avoid and flee all idolatry, witchcraft, superstition, and prayer to saints or to other creatures. End quote. Protestantism's approach to the idea of praying to the dead is rooted in the fact that prayer implies worship, and worship is to be reserved for God alone. The other area where Protestant theology clearly broke with medieval Catholicism relative to the dead was the matter of purgatory. The issue of indulgences raised by Luther clearly connects closely to this doctrine. Luther's comment on Genesis 36, verse 9, is typical of Protestant disdain for the idea. And I quote, "In this way God gathered and preserved his church from the beginning, just as under the papacy, baptism, the keys, the Eucharist, and other pure articles of faith were retained, while the Pope in the meantime established others concerning relics, the invocation of saints, and purgatory, by which he corrupted and weakened sound doctrine." End quotes. Justification by grace through faith and the imputation of Christ's righteousness rendered the doctrine not simply redundant but also obnoxious. Yet the fact that Protestant theology excluded traditional Catholic constructions of the relationship between living piety and the dead does not mean that the dead cease to be present in a sense among the living. To quote the modern Welsh poet Dylan Thomas about his late father, "Until I die, he will not leave my side." The theological separation of the living and the dead does not require the absence of the dead from among the living or their powerful impact upon the present, as a myriad of photographs of dead loved ones in homes today indicates, or pictures of Luther in Lutheran households after his death would have indicated. We might also point to the proximity of graveyards to places of worship among churches, Protestant as well as Roman Catholic until very recently. The dead may be dead, but walking past one's parents' graves on the way into worship each time surely gave them some presence, some impact upon personal piety. In fact, the increasing absence of the dead from modern life probably has less to do with ideas in themselves and more to do with changes in medical care and funereal practices. An interesting experiment in class each year. Typically, at some point, I'll ask how many people in the class have seen a dead body. And usually only medical professionals under the age of 40 will respond positively to that. It's almost a watershed age 40. If you're under the age 40 and not a medical professional, chances are you haven't seen a dead body. That makes a difference to how you think about the world. Hospitals and hospices have become the locations for many deaths rather than the home. Few churches are now built with graveyards. Those cemeteries which do exist are often detached from areas of public conversation. And cremation can indeed erase all traces of the dead. And even if the traditional theology, which connected the living and the dead together, was denied by Protestantism, it is very clear that the belief in the afterlife and its connection to the present persisted both in folk religious practices and later in movements such as spiritualism and beliefs such as reincarnation. One does not have to be an adherent of Aleister Crowley to believe the relationship between the living and the dead is a very real one. There are few, if any, places, even in the secular West, where some form of popular assumption that life continues after death does not grip many imaginations, as witnessed by the fact that mediums and seances remain, apparently if the TV commercials are anything to go by, a relatively lucrative business. And this brings us to a key question. Exactly how disenchanted did the world become as a result of Lutheran Protestantism? Charles Taylor has no doubt and expresses himself on the matter with a sweeping statement of uncharacteristic conciseness. When Charles Taylor says something briefly, you know that it has to be an absolutely self-evident truth. Everyone can agree, he says, that one of the big differences between us and our ancestors of 500 years ago is that they lived in an enchanted world and we do not. Simple and straightforward as that. But is this really so? First, we might note that the whole idea of disenchantment depends upon the world being first enchanted. And this is a very tricky subject, precisely because a moment's reflection indicates that we are talking here really, I think, about matters of degree, and not about clean, discrete, mutually exclusive categories. The medieval peasant farmer may well have prayed to the saints to protect his crops, but he still ploughed the fields and scattered the grain, and that at certain points in the year. For the medieval farmer, therefore, crop production was, to a very important degree, a matter, we might say, of disenchanted technique within a relatively predictable world with regard to its seasons. The same applies to other trades involving technical skill. The carpenter, even in the Middle Ages, typically used a saw to cut wood. Luther may have prayed to St. Anne to save him in the famous thunderstorm, but he would also have grown up praying for her as the patron saint of miners to protect his father. But his father presumably also took typical precautions for his own safety, for mining was not just a matter of saintly protection or of magic, but also following the appropriate methods. It may have been that the farmers and carpenters and miners believed that their prayers to the saints had an effect, but that enchantment sat happily alongside less enchanted technical skills. Second, this then raises questions regarding the demystifying or disenchantment of the modern world. Now, it is one thing, I think, to lament such from a university campus dominated by materialist postmodernism. Quite another thing to ask that question of other contexts. Intellectuals may like to think that they are representative of society as a whole, but that is far from the case. When we come, therefore, to look at the larger picture of social picture in the West, some interesting observations present themselves, even at the time of the Reformation. For example, if you look at church discipline cases in Scotland in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, I'm a Presbyterian. The disadvantages were very boring. The advantage is that being very boring, we keep incredibly good records, which means we're very useful to historians. If you look at the records of church discipline cases in Scotland, in rural Scotland, in the late 16th and early 17th century, the preponderance of cases seem to have dealt with matters that we might refer to as folk religious practices. It wasn't that you were disciplining people for running off to mass at every opportunity. You were disciplining people for running off to the local wise woman and trying to get her to cast a spell so the milkmaid would fall in love with you. Raises a question, is it Protestantism or urbanization which creates disenchantment? I grew up in a very rural part of England. All kinds of weird stuff. My wife grew up in the Outer Hebrides, even weirder stuff in the Outer Hebrides. She better not ever see this video because she would be very upset for me describing it as weird, but it's very strange. Certainly, folk religious practices and beliefs coexisted alongside Orthodox Protestantism in rural areas for many centuries, I would say down to the present day, in places like the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. We might point, for example, to Luther's constant references to the physical activities of the devil and his minions in the world around him, even down to an attempted assassination attempt by the devil who pushed over a wall on the reformer. This kind of thing scarcely dies out in Protestantism. Witness, for example, the writings of the 19th century Presbyterian elder, conservative Calvinist and journalist Hugh Miller. He can move seamlessly from folklore to theology within a single paragraph. One minute he's talking about the fairies at the bottom of his garden. The next minute he's discussing fine points of Calvinist polity. Further, research done on the modern world has indicated that even in the West, the idea of disenchantment has been profoundly overplayed. Modern classical music and architecture may seem on the whole to lack any profound sense of mystery. But anecdotally, one can hardly walk down a high street or switch on the television without seeing advertisements for tarot readings and fortune tellers. In the field of medicine, surely the poster child of modern science in terms of immediate public impact, the rise and popularity of homeopathic remedies, bogus I think as many of them may be, seem to strike a chord with many members of the public. And again, rural areas exhibit higher levels of what sophisticated urbanites might dismiss as folk superstition regarding the existence of spirits and sprites. Add to the mystical dimensions of the mystical dimensions of some part of the Green movement, the interest in meditation and Eastern religion, and the powerful rise of religions such as Islam, and the difference between us and our ancestors of 500 years ago appears less in the fact that our world is disenchanted and more in the sheer range of enchantments which are now on offer and which we are free to choose. Choice, not enchantment, might be the key to the difference. Luthero remoto. Given all that has been thus far said, we might perhaps engage now in a little thought experiment along Anselmic lines with Luthero remoto, with Luther removed. What would have happened if Luther, and to keep these discussions ecumenical, Zwingli had never lived? Would modernity in its Western form have been avoided? I don't think so. First, as noted above, rising literacy rates, fueled by the printing press, urbanization and the rise of commerce, would have brought in their wake challenges to established forms of authority. Indeed, we might add that commerce in itself would have done so, as it led to changes in the nature and distribution of power in Europe. But even at a more conceptual level, church authority was already in very serious trouble long before Luther was even born. the multiple simultaneous popes of the late 14th and early 15th centuries surely damaged the notion of the papacy in a fundamental way. That the problem was resolved by a council merely begs the question of how that does not in itself shatter that which it sought to establish, a coherent authority built around the preeminence of the Roman pontiff. Luther did not invent the crisis of authority. If anything, he was a response to the crisis of authority. Second, this conclusion, of course, points back to the fundamental problem with Gregory's narrative. While the Reformation no doubt had unintended consequences, it is very clear that his own narrative actually roots the problems in late medieval Catholicism's rejection of Thomism. The Reformation thus becomes simply one of the effects of the failures of medieval Catholicism to maintain itself in a coherent form, rather than a first cause of the collapse of the Catholic monopoly in Western Europe. If the Reformation is to blame for the chaos of secular relativism, then by Gregory's own account, medieval Catholicism is to blame for the Reformation. Third, as noted above, pervasive interpretive pluralism is surely as much a function of literacy as it is of Protestantism. When large numbers of people can read a text, there will be disagreements over what the text means. I'm tempted to say facetiously, if you teach 10 people to read, you'll have 12 different interpretations of a text. Without wanting to score cheap denominational points, that's a lie. I do want to score a cheap denominational point at this point. The recent debates within Roman Catholicism over Amoris Laetitia, the 2016 post-synodal apostolic exhortation, particularly those surrounding footnote 351, indicate that Protestantism has no monopoly over contested understandings of written texts, and that papal authority is itself a contested doctrinal subject, or so it seems, one subject to interpretive pluralism. And that is hardly the only debate going on within Roman Catholicism over the meaning of dogmatic pronouncements. I'm tempted to say choice as well is very significant here. Was it Stanley Hauerwas who said, we're all Congregationalists now? To be a Roman Catholic today is a choice. To be a Roman Catholic is a Protestant action. Fourth, and as I hinted earlier, the lacuna in the narratives presented by Taylor, Ira, and Gregory is that of how the elite ideas of university professors shape the common currency of demotic discourse in the 16th century and beyond. Certain material conditions, social, economic, technological, need to exist for certain ideas to have any practical significance. We might, for example, point to Taylor's emphasis on the shift from mimesis to poiesis as critical in the changing understanding of selfhood and the relationship of human beings to the world. But that move is not simply or even primarily the result of voluntarism in thinking. It is surely just as much, if not more, the result of rising technologies and economic transformations. Technology, as thinkers such as George Grant and Michael Hanby have pointed out, is ontology. It brings with it a way of looking at the world and its possibilities and its relationship to the individual. Modern chaotic relativism for the average man or woman in the street is surely as much the product of the existence of popular mass media rooted in information technology as it is of anything Martin Luther might have written. Again, on this score, we might see the Protestant Reformation as one of the products of a technological media revolution. That's hardly an original point, rather than its cause. Fifth, was it really the Reformation that introduced choice to the religious marketplace, one of Taylor's key hallmarks of the secular world? One might say that perhaps the papacy did this in 1054, when the Pope excommunicated the ecumenical patriarch. Maybe, if you're Dermot McCulloch, it was the Council of Chalcedon in 451. One might object, of course, that this is not the case, since most would still only have had one religion on offer in their geographical locale. But there lies the rub. Yes, the Reformers certainly fueled a range of options that were conceptually available, strictly in terms of the institutionalization of different religious creeds. They certainly made the fragmentation of Christianity a much more familiar, acceptable, and plausible concept. I always start my Reformation lectures by asking the students, what do you think Martin Luther would have said in 1510 if you'd said to him, 10 years from now there'll be a religious choice? And the answer, I think, is he wouldn't even have had the conceptual vocabulary to respond. They certainly, the reformers, I think, fueled a range of options, made fragmentation more acceptable. But choice still requires the ability to choose. And if we think at the practical level of daily life as experienced by most people, the practical choices generated by the Reformation were really no more real than that. There was no real religious choice, I think, in Calvin's Geneva, or Luther's Wittenberg, or Bullinger's Zurich. In England, the Book of Common Prayer was imposed with draconian penalties in the reigns of Edward VI, Elizabeth, James I, Charles I, and Charles II. Even in England until the 19th century, those who dissented from the Church of England were subject to social marginalisation and sporadic judicial persecution. I often wonder, thinking of Weber's thesis in England, was it Protestantism or marginalisation that made the great industrialists of the 19th century? I think it was probably the fact they couldn't do anything else than make stuff and sell it that made them successful. Surely it was only with the rise of colonial and then revolutionary America, I'm tempted to say rebellious America, but that would probably not go down well, revolutionary America, that religious choice started to become a real practical possibility. And even then, for most people, I think, it was the invention of the internal combustion engine, with its shattering of the power of local geography, that made religious choice truly an option for many. Conclusion. There is no doubt that the traditional triumphalist reading of the significance of the Reformation is now under considerable strain. The great unravelling of Western civilization, or perhaps to put it in more neutral terms, its dramatic remodelling, is taking place rapidly all around us. And therein lies the problem, at least with the narratives of Ira and Gregory. It is very clear that they disapprove of much of modernity in its Western form and are looking for someone to blame. The Reformation thus becomes a useful target. But the question is this: as we are beneficiaries of things such as universal education, literacy and technology, and would presumably wish to affirm that each of these things has done at least some good, can we have the benefits without the risk of the problems? Can we have universal education and literacy without challenges to traditional authority or vigorous disagreements over truth in the public square? Can we have the freedom which the automobile provides without the industrialization that at least risks something like the organized murder of the Holocaust or the technologized warfare that places civilians at risk as never before? Bewailing the times in which we live and finding people, generally not ourselves, to blame is a time-honored practice. This is perhaps where I would give Charles Taylor the edge over other advocates of the "it was the reformers what done it" tabloid headline. Taylor describes and explains more than he blames and decries. I would suggest that such an approach is appropriate. Please don't take me as saying I want to return to the triumphalist narrative. I want a more complicated narrative, if you like, to emerge. Yes, we are remembering an important anniversary this year, but like all anniversaries of its kind, it is neither a cause of unalloyed rejoicing nor blanket lamentation. It is more complicated than that, and if all that we do is some version of the blame game, we will not have truly benefited from what careful reflection upon the Reformation can really tell us about why our world is the way it is. To close, and to end by sounding like a hackneyed Christian cliché monger, let me use the words of a Roman Catholic writer, J.R.R. Tolkien. In chapter 2 of The Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf and Frodo discuss the darkness of the times in which they live. These words seem most applicable to those of us who are perhaps dismayed by much of what is happening in the world around us, and who might be tempted to spend our lives indulging in that sterile form of nostalgia, the retrospective blame game, rather than using our analyses of the past to understand and engage the present better. And I quote, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." Thanks for listening so patiently.
sure there will be plenty of questions. We have about 30 minutes, so rather than, I thought about maybe we should organize one topic at the time. I thought that's not going to be possible. So have at it. I'll try to moderate. Who will have the first question?
Since I got a chair. Anyway, I didn't get a chair at Notre Dame, so I got one here. Anyway.
There you go.
I like your idea very much of technology, but I want to back up out of the Reformation and talk about here. Because there are a couple books that my wife read, so I steal all these ideas from her. 1491 and 1493. And the world is radically different on either ends of those dates. And I've also read a book recently called The Invention of Discovery. And the term discovery did not exist until Columbus.
Yeah.
So, and the New World was the discovery.
Yeah.
And they had no word in any language, Latin, Greek, anything, to call it. So they coined this term, because inventio, as you know in Latin, is the closest you could come. But that's discovering something already there. But discovering something unknown was an unknown element. And that idea of and as you know, natural philosophy was based on authority. Galen said this, Aristotle said that, Pliny said that, and none of them said, oh, and by the way, between China and Europe is an entire series of continents. Right?
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could, if that, I mean, it's basically expanding your horizon to make the case that the disorientation that takes place, that we're all part of, is a broader and older thing than just religious. It has religious and political and other connotations, but I'm just wondering what you would make of 1492.
Yeah, I've not thought of that at all. I wonder if I was Brad Gregory, I might use that to say, well, this sort of starts to turn an orientation towards the future. The frontier, the horizon, that kind of thing would produce a future orientation in thinking. Certainly, of course, I'm thinking of some 17th century Puritans. It precipitates not exactly crisis is an overworked term. It raises all kinds of questions about the exclusivity of Christianity as a whole that had never been addressed before, other than perhaps in relation to the Jews and Islam. So I've not thought about that, but that's a fascinating idea.
Because the people sailing the ships were Roman Catholics.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
Yeah, I'd not thought of that at all. And again, my big question with Ira and Gregory is, how does this get down to the level of the ordinary man in the streets? And you come across something like that, and it's a whole lot easier to explain, I think. But I've not thought of that. I'll go away and think about that. Thanks. Thanks for that, Randall.
Sir, where I'm seeing a lot of this disenchantment narrative is more on the fringes with Catholics complaining about the political move from a system of a monarch coronated by a bishop or whatever, and that ecclesial power still being present there, to liberal democracy. And the complaint is that we had this wonderful thing back here, this wonderful system, and now we have people, like name a politician who's horrible.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you had.
Well, again, that's a good point. My question would be a sort of to push back as well. Name me a pope who was good in the Middle Ages. We know politicians today are corrupt and venal. As a historian, that doesn't seem to be a recent development. I think the technological potentialities for corruption and venality are different today, but I don't really see the 14th, 15th century papacy as any paragon of virtue. What does change there, of course, is your view of the world as having a divinely established order, which is placed under strain. But again, if it was Brad Gregory pressing that point, I would want to press back. So why is it under strain? It's under strain precisely because it claims one thing and it's simply not able to deliver on its claims. So I find a lot of, not with all my Catholic friends, but with a number of my Catholic friends, a somewhat romanticized view of the Middle Ages undergirds their view of the disenchantment of the modern age. I'm just reading through Dante's Divine Comedy. There are a lot of popes in hell. Dante's quite aware of the problems that are there. So I think the narrative is predicated on, if not a golden age, at least a silver age in the Middle Ages, that I don't think was actually there in many ways. And what I want to say is the Middle Ages were not as good as these people say they are, and the modern age is not as bad. I still want to live today rather than 100 years ago. Just an example of my father. My father grew up, and his earliest memories were running to the bomb shelter to avoid the Blitz. I'm not sure I want to live 50 years ago before the terrible revolution of the 60s, because at least I've never had to run for a bomb shelter. So I don't want to come at that from a, let's relativize the badness of the modern age and the virtues of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, thanks for your paper. I was wondering where the Enlightenment fits in this narrative.
Yeah, that's going beyond my own area of expertise. I'm really interested on, can you blame the Reformation? I'm happy to blame the Enlightenment. They're not my guys. Brad Gregory would see the Enlightenment, I think, as the natural outgrowth of Protestantism tearing away all the traditional external views of authority and turning religion inwards. So for him, the Enlightenment would be the foul fruit of Protestantism. Again, my pushback on that would be, it's more complicated than that. Descartes was not a Protestant. Descartes' critical in this story, and he's not a Protestant. But certainly, if you're going to write a history of the rise of, if you were to ask me what's the characteristic of modern man, I would say psychologized identity lies at the very heart of it. So, for example, transgenderism, without making a comment one way or the other on whether it's a good or a bad thing, it seems to me that when somebody says I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, they're really prioritizing a psychological view of their identity over a more physically conditioned view of their identity. And I think the Enlightenment is absolutely critical in the psychologizing of identity. Brad Gregory would see that as an outgrowth of Reformation internalizing of religion, I think. But clearly it's an important staging post on the way.
I wonder how that would fit in a little more with your argument of Luther's nominalism. Whereas, especially with a lot of the other reformers, they seem to have a more Platonic understanding of substance and nature. So how does the nominalism fit in, especially bringing it forward to the ideas of transgenderism?
Yeah.
That nothing fits, and there's no essence or substance.
Yeah, I would certainly, and I've actually made this case in print, that I think transgenderism rests upon a form of nominalism. Not that I think transgender people are reading Occam and going away and coming up with their ideas, but it is a form of nominalism. And Terry Eagleton, the Marxist literary critic, has made this point that postmodernism has potent similarities to what's going on in the late Middle Ages. When you come to Luther, I think I hesitate to comment on Luther with my friend Bob Kolb sitting in the audience. It seems to me that Luther's adherence to nominalism is more complicated than often made the case. I mean, he has this profoundly realist understanding of the presence in the Lord's Supper, which doesn't seem to me to be consistently nominalist. It's not that Christ is present there because the priest happens to say the words. Something's really going on there. Jesus' body is really coming and joining the body, the bread and the wine. So I would want to go in depth and look at how. My instinct is that Luther's nominalism is a critical appropriation of nominalism, but not a blind adherence to it.
Is his nominalism just a reaction against Thomistic assumptions, the Aristotelian Thomistic assumptions?
I think Luther's nominalism, I wouldn't characterize it as a reaction. I think it's a product of his education. He's educated in the Occamist tradition. He studies Gabriel Biel's Canon of the Mass. He's deriving it from the late medieval tradition from which he comes. I think one of the things we need to remember about the Reformers is that none of them were super competent in all areas of medieval philosophy. They were very much shaped by the background. I mean, Calvin makes some embarrassing statements about what the medievals believed in the Institutes. And it's very clear they didn't actually believe what he says they believed. So I think Luther's nominalism It's just what he was taught. And he doesn't like Thomism as a result of what he's been taught and what he's been taught about it.
So I'm curious if there's any research into looking at ancient cultures that considered themselves modern, particularly before the Reformation, say the Greco-Roman culture. They had significant changes from what was immediately before them. If you looked at what the sources of those could have been, what other things could have been blamed on, since obviously it's not the Reformation.
I have not. I'm afraid that's not an area that I'm familiar with at all. Sorry.
Why were the reformers such whipping boys for these people? And what attracted Weber and Ira to just pile on?
I think Weber is genuinely wrestling with the problems of industrialized Germany. I think that's where he's coming from. I think the problem with answering that question is one moves fairly rapidly into imputing psychological motives to people. It would be very easy to say, you know, Brad Gregory is a convert to Catholicism. Of course he would hold this view. And I think that's a cheap shot. You have to deal with a man's arguments as they're presented. But I don't think his Catholicism is incidental to his thesis. Because, and one of the reasons I would argue that is, he doesn't seem prepared to blame Catholicism, when his own narrative would seem to require that. That when you're saying, look, Scotus is the problem, but then you dump all the blame on the reformers, that's an odd move to make, I think. And at that point, you start to think, what's really going on here? I think, and I would say this myself, my own confessional commitments, of course, they are not incidental to what I do. I hope my arguments stand on their own 2 feet. But the reason why I have the interests I have and perhaps pursue the lines I have is related to my own personal confessional commitments. I hope my argument, as I say, has a coherence and a validity of itself. But if Brad Gregory was to respond, well, you would say that because you're a Protestant, I'd have to say, well, yes, but can you now tell me where my arguments are wrong? Yes.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. I hadn't seen you there.
On the question of romanticizing the Middle Ages and the question of disenchantment, what do you think about medieval practices, especially, I mean, the sorts of things that Luther was attacking, indulgences and all of the merit-acquiring practices, were those something that really conveyed enchantment, or were they almost a technology just of trying to achieve perceived goods? What would you think about that?
That's an interesting question, because I'm not sure that those are the only 2 options. I think a sense of belonging is important as well. When I teach medieval at Westminster, I try to get the students to read a bit of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which seems to me to be a great way of getting into at least a literary representation of a pilgrimage. I wonder if a sense of belonging kicks into it as well. I mean, there are folk practices that long outlive the sort of the ideological underpinnings to which they're attached. Morris dancing would be one of the oddest examples from England that I think convey a sense of belonging. Again, the problem that you get into there is that you're trying to read the minds of people. Right. Way back when. We can speculate about what drove them, but it's difficult to come down hard and fast on a particular solution to that. And I mean, Eamon Duffy does a good job in his stripping of the altars of pointing to the vibrant popularity of pilgrimages and shrines and things in immediately pre-Reformation England. I think the Protestant narrative that has Europe desperately waiting for the Reformation to arrive is a very flawed one, because the evidence suggests that is not the case. People don't like change. But what exactly motivates them, I think, is a matter for some speculation.
Go ahead.
Hi. I was wondering if I could change your thesis a little bit. So instead of looking and saying, can we blame the reformers for these things, does your argument work also against lauding them? I'm thinking, for example, Peter Harrison's argument, how much the Reformation played in the rise of modern science.
Yeah.
And underneath your examples, of course, the automobile, modern medicine, technology, modern sciences, underneath all of these. So would your argument play out the same way?
Yeah, I think so. I want to eschew triumphalism as much as I want to eschew the blame game. That's why, of the three, Taylor's narrative I find most appealing, because I think he's basically describing and explaining rather than judging, whereas the other two guys are definitely evaluating and finding the Reformation severely wanting. But I have as little patience with triumphalist narratives of the Reformation. And as I said, if you look at Luther, would Luther have believed in liberal democracy? Absolutely not. I mean, the Reformers themselves were very archaic figures on those levels. I think the ideas they put in place triggered things that led to those things ultimately, but it's not a straightforward genealogy. So I would suggest that the Reformation has been subject to polemical contention from almost the moment Luther stuck the 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg. I think that those approaches are not the most helpful way of getting at how modernity has emerged. Because is modernity a good thing or a bad thing? To me, it's a thing, or it's a collection of things, some of which I like and some of which I dislike. But I'm not sure that I can successfully have those bits I like without also having the bits that I abominate. I can't have freedom of speech without allowing somebody to tear my paper apart this afternoon. I can't give the paper unless there's a risk of somebody disagreeing with it. So I'd like to move discussions in a sort of direction of saying, okay, well, this is what we've got. How did we get here? And what can we learn from how we got here? Rather than using it as a way of consolidating contemporary confessional positions.
Other questions? Running out of steam?
I just have one quota to pick up on. Almost all of Luther's most vehement opponents were nominalists. I just think this nominalism determining a theological position is a complete dead end.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you called the question. And none of them were Thomists, by the way.
Yeah.
So it's just puzzling to me that Luther gets identified with nominalism.
Well, he theologically abominated the nominalists, of course. I mean, some of his strongest words are reserved for them.
So he's an alchemist in terms of the forms of his thinking, but he disagreed with them theologically.
Yeah.
So it's very complex. So anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you to Carl.
Oh, nice.